Hello, and welcome to Wavicle, the podcast that reflects on the process of being part of Social Action Inquiry Scotland. We delve into what has emerged for us during this process of being part of the inquiry. We highlight our learnings and unlearnings, and we explore the topics that have been rooted within us. I'm Amanda, and today on the podcast, I am joined by 3 guests who have been involved in the inquiry's storytelling journey. And in this episode, we delve a little bit deeper into storytelling. We invite you to reflect along the way with us, and I offer some questions to ponder at the end of the episode. The storytelling we're referring to in this episode relates to the 17 storytelling pieces with communities across Scotland who partnered with the inquiry. These stories can be found in the stories section of our website, socialaction.scot. Now let's get into the conversation. Thank you very much for joining me today on this podcast. We're talking about storytelling, and I have Deborah, who is one of our co-leads for the inquiry. We've got Mohamed here, who is one of the storytellers that's been involved. And we've also got Patrick, who has also been a storyteller and is also one of our guides. So I just want to say thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us over.
Echo that.
And just to kick us off, we just thought we'd start with a check-in question. And because we're talking about storytelling, I thought we'd have a bit of fun by saying, if you were a storytelling medium today, so whether that's audio or fictional writing, interpretive dance, documentary making, all of the above, what best describes how you're feeling today?
I think it'd be sort of like a 4-wall visual art exhibit in like a modern art gallery. So sort of quite open, quite interesting, hopefully some good chats. Yeah, quite a good one, I hope.
Thanks, Patrick. Ooh.
I don't know. I think I'm going a little out there. I think I'm going to be something like an opera or something, like a kind of a storytelling through an opera form, because I feel quite intense. I feel quite tense as well in terms of the emotions that I came in today with. But I feel also because it's coming to an end of the inquiry, I'm reflecting on the process and where it started. And I just feel quite emotional about that whole thing and the process. And I feel like singing it out loud. Not that I'm a good singer, but I just feel like singing it out loud. That's that feeling about how we went through that process and the story of storytelling within the inquiry. Yeah, so an opera of storytelling, I think, is my medium at the moment.
Thanks, Debbie. Another interesting choice. Mohamed, no pressure.
I was just going to say, I love your answers. I think for me, it might be flash fiction. It's that sort of thing where I'm feeling a lot of different emotions. I think this is just Edinburgh also in autumn. It gives me that vignette vibe where I'm just kind of like recapping everything in the summer, which a large part of it was also kind of the work with Social Action Inquiry. So just kind of recalling a lot of that.
Thank you, Mohamed. That's great. I think for me, I feel a little bit like a piece of poetry, but it's quite repetitive. It keeps saying the same thing over again, and there's like breaks, and then it's quite forward maybe. I don't know what that type of poetry would be called. In my mind right now, I'm trying to think of all the things that are going on in my head and then trying to bring myself back and be like, okay, no, we're here, we're being present. And then my mind will wander off and be like, we're doing these things. Like, no, be present. So I think that's how I'm feeling today. First question we're going to explore together, because we're talking about storytelling, is what does storytelling mean to you or feel like to you? And feel free to expand on that however you feel fit.
I feel like it's quite varied. I think storytelling means something completely different to different people. To me, I think storytelling is just a way of sharing your beliefs, sharing your values, sharing your experiences through whatever medium. Especially in the way that we did the storytelling project, I just think it's a way to get people in your community and people in the wider world just to try and spend a day in your shoes. I think storytelling is a way where you can communicate your experiences and your thoughts through something that does end up quite often beautiful by having different mediums and different art that's attached to it. So I think it's quite a beautiful thing. It's very human.
I absolutely love that idea, and I think just putting yourself in someone else's shoes is Definitely something that I feel as well when it comes to storytelling. It's an opportunity to share a bit of an experience that might be a bit too far away for the reader to have had access to. But kind of like through the medium of storytelling, you create this world and give them kind of like the toolbox through which they can actually explore a thing that they might have otherwise just not been aware of. And yeah, just more than being informative, it's very emotive. So it hopefully allows space for them to also kind of like make their own connections outside of what my intentionality as an author would have been.
Yeah, I think I agree with both what you, Patrick, and you, Mohammed. I think it's part of my idea of storytelling as well. In addition to that, for me, like the memory of storytelling is related to the intergenerational legacy of what I heard from growing up, when I was a little child and I heard all these stories from my ancestors. But now I am gathering all of these, telling them in different ways, and I'm going to tell them to the next generation, my child and her friends. That's the beauty of the storytelling for me, and that's the memory I have. Stories live beyond time and beyond you as a person. So I think that intergenerational legacy for me is the power of storytelling, and that's the one which kind of triggers the most emotion and memory in me.
I think it helps humanize people in the past as well, because the first stories were probably cave paintings, and we look now at caves and we see this evidence of humans from the past, and the way that we can make sure that we know they're humans and the same as us is because they told stories to each other through art. I think it's one of the most fundamental parts of being a human and not just being an animal is our ability to tell stories, to make art, and to share our own experiences, which transcends time and generations.
And it does provide that wealth of archive to actually draw back upon. And I think which was very much a crux of the storytelling project that I did with Simon and Congolese community was that feeling of wanting to have an archive. We're present at this time, this is what we experienced, just to, even if things don't change for them, but yeah, just for future generations.
Beautiful answers. I think that really nicely flows into intergenerational passing on those stories, that full-on human aspect. I think that really fits into what we were trying to achieve in the inquiry as well. Debbie, I was just wondering why you started dreaming about storytelling rather than doing a traditional research, for example. And if you want to say, for those who are engaging with this podcast, what traditional research approach would be, and then storytelling and why they are different or why they're similar.
Thank you, Amanda. I come from a pure academic social science background, and after completing my PhD, what I consider traditional at least, it's about going into the field and collecting interviews and coming back and analyzing interviews, using softwares to do that, making sense of that. So there is a lot of that in storytelling, but it follows a very scientific and structured model which puts you in a power position to the community that you are actually engaging with. Also, when you say research and traditional research, there is a little elitist angle to it, alongside a set of disillusionment. They are all with restricted funding, right? So I go into the field, I collect all this material, I come in, and then I go on and publish my papers. How much do I give back to the community, and what do I give back? Is some form of disillusionment that I've experienced as a researcher. Folk engaging with the podcast may not agree with me, but that's my interpretation of it. And that's how I felt and experienced it. So along with all these things which associated with traditional research made me dream around something which I felt would be less extractive, more inclusive, more accessible. Everyone loves a story, right? And everyone can tell a story. Everyone can gather a story. Everyone can listen to a story. And I think that is, for me, the power of storytelling, which actually drove me to dream about storytelling. Then I was in a different world. So I was thinking of a prefigurative world where everyone is a storyteller and anyone can be a storyteller and bringing in their own expertise. And that's where I sowed the seed for it. But I think there were other considerations which I was also thinking of, was the values of the inquiry. And that being, the value of working emergently, inclusively, relationally. And the method on reflection, the method which would best suit it would be storytelling. Not just with the outputs, how you collect or how you gather the story. So the whole process was quite inclusive from the start to the end in many ways. And I think in that way, I could embed the values of the inquiry into the storytelling process. And storytelling would be a reflective process. And through that reflective process, every one part of it would have a chance to actually learn and unlearn and feel the power of it, not being exclusive to only some. So the power, the reflective thinking, and the whole gift of learning and unlearning was possible.
Thanks, Debbie. I'm just wondering if you could give our audience an idea of how you start that process, because you're dreaming about storytelling. You know you want to incorporate all those values that you've mentioned, being emergent, relational work, being inclusive, this co-storytelling model, the trust in communities to do storytelling. So I'm wondering if you could just explain a little bit about how you got there and what some of those elements mean.
Yeah, I think I like to begin with the model in the inquiry is a co-model. We all work in co, so we have the co-chairs, we have the co-leads. Having experienced this power of co and the joy and the challenge of having expertise in two ways join into one, sense-checking ideas with each other, having someone lead you and leading at other points, that was important for me to kind of download. Usually we talk about when we work in communities or when we work on projects, you always analyze things around downloading risks. I think for me, it was important to download power. A lone storyteller doing all this with the community would feel quite lacking in solidarity, lacking in power to voice out something. And hence we thought of a co-storytelling model. I think it was also in the sense of time, because time was very precious. And, we were thinking, if someone comes in as a storyteller and goes in the community, they would need some time to build trust, because we are talking about working relationally. So we needed someone who would be from the community, but at the same time would also have a creative angle to them. So to bring in these two storytellers together, one who has an expertise in the community knowledge and community relationships and community trust, and a co-storyteller who had an expertise in the creative outputs, and each having their own expertise, feeling equal, was the thinking behind developing the co-storytelling model.
Thank you for sharing that, Debbie. Mohamed and Patrick, it'd be really interesting for our audience to hear a little bit about you and your co-storyteller and the community that you worked with and the medium that you used as well and how you went about that.
Yeah, so I worked with a storyteller called Eleanor, who has a lot of experience doing collaborative arts. She's currently right now, she's down in Cali at the refugee camp, and she works with kids there to do collaborative art projects. So we were friends before we decided to start doing this, and we chose to work with Families First, which was a community that Eleanor had volunteered for in the past. So the organisation basically works with disadvantaged kids in the East Nook of Fife, and it provides one-to-one befriending services, youth groups, and trips out for young people. So we worked with this community and the young people to hold an art exhibition. We made these massive canvases. Hopefully there's some photos of it online somewhere for our audience. They're about 1.5 meters tall, and we got a group of about a dozen kids to paint it, and then we had everybody that's involved with Families First painted this little portrait of themselves that we stuck onto these free canvases. And we just sort of interviewed everyone that was involved, volunteers, youth workers, the parents and the kids, to get their thoughts on how Families First was a pivotal role in raising children. So we titled our piece, "It Takes a Village to Raise a Child," and we just did that as a way of highlighting the need for these organisations to take a step in when maybe statutory services or parents just feel like they can't do everything themselves. We had amazing response from the parents. We had parents saying, "This service has helped save us. This has helped us as a family. This has helped take some of the pressures off." And it was just beautiful to be able to see how this organisation changes so many people's lives and to be a part of sharing their story with the wider community.
I was working with a community from the Democratic Republic of the Congo in Glasgow. Essentially, they're a grassroots organization of refugees and asylum seekers, mostly led by Simon, who is the community guide as well that I was working with. And essentially the project that we were doing was a storytelling project around their experiences during COVID. Simon obviously was part of the community and helped to build it up, and he's been an activist and organizer around Glasgow and refugee communities for quite a while. He has been pushing for free bus passes for refugees for quite a few years. And he went to the community and asked who would be up for sharing their story. But because obviously a lot of the community are fearful and worried about their status in the UK, a lot of them were hesitant. But Simon had built enough trust and had told them, "We'll handle your stories with care, we'll respect anonymity." And he obviously had a good relationship with Social Action Inquiry. So we set about building our relationship and building that trust and communicating, and then Simon shared the stories, and I started writing them out as short stories and would go back to Simon and just to ask him for a bit more detail, for example, on certain things, just to make sure that I wasn't messing up the facts. Essentially asking me to fictionalize real people's narratives, and that felt like a huge responsibility, especially because I wasn't interacting with them directly. So I needed to feel comfortable with the output, and Simon was always very supportive, reading stuff, giving feedback, and giving me straight information when I needed it.
Thanks, Mohamed. Yeah, it's definitely interesting that both of you had such different experiences on how close you could get to the community because of trust. Patrick, like you say, Elena, already knowing that community really well and having volunteered with them in the past. And then the both of you having trust with each other, already being friends.
That was definitely a massive part of it, is our pre-relationship, which allowed us to communicate a lot more freely because there wasn't really that boundary of, I'm speaking to a professional, I need to be really professional. We just sent each other Facebook messages. And having that freedom of conversation did allow for a much faster and more convenient way to communicate, because we just sort of like cut everything we didn't need out and we were very straightforward with each other.
Mohamed, how was that for you? Because obviously that's a very different experience to what you had, having just met Simon.
Yeah, so it was a very different experience for me, also just working with Simon and the Congolese community, because I had no direct contact with the people whose stories I was actually writing down. I just had contact with Simon because of reasons of anonymity. And it just reminded me of what you were mentioning before about emergent strategies and building trust as well, because I think that was the first conversation we had was around kind of emergent strategies of storytelling and the importance of building a proper relationship. But yeah, when the project is condensed within 3 months, obviously you have to put the relationship in kind of like a hyperdrive and just compress it real quick. I remember the first meeting that I had. Simon was worried about issues of anonymity, and I was just trying to gently persuade by being like, I've done this and this sort of work, like it'll be fine. And Debbie just told me, you'll build trust, it's fine, slow down, don't feel the need to kind of essentially lay out credentials. Like that was such a good thing to hear at that point. Yeah, it just made the communication a lot more easy and less extractive. It was all about just trying to build some sort of rapport through which we can produce this project. Simon was absolutely lovely to work with, always very generous whenever I had a question about any sort of detail around the storytelling. Also, because of the amount of trauma that community experienced, it would have been impossible to keep going back to ask those same community members to keep resharing these very deeply traumatic stories. And it would have been too much work on him as well, because obviously with a community with complex needs, it's hard to coordinate meetings. Any one meeting can take weeks to plan, which is a lot of work on him as well. And he also works for freedom from torture at the same time.
Can I come in here? I mean, both the communities that Patrick worked with and Mohamed worked with, just to kind of say that for me, from the inquiry's point of view, just had to have a couple of meetings, have a clear brief, and that was them just working with trust then, I mean, there was that trust from the inquiry as well, and then at the end there was a story. The check-ins were mostly about, okay, how is it going, but not, oh, are you doing your work, or, oh, are we doing our work from either side? But at the same time, doesn't mean that happened everywhere, and a relationship needed more facilitation for that relationship to build, so the inquiry needed more work around that. I just wanted to bring that perspective in as well, because we didn't have that in the room at the moment.
If I can just add to that, that definitely helped with the kind of storytelling that Simon and I were doing. Obviously, not having access to the community just made it quite difficult to almost trust my own work and output. You have no idea how it's landing, and especially if you're writing a story about a community, you want the community to see themselves reflected within it. You're not just being extractive and writing about them, but also knowing the amount of trust that Simon was placing in me as well just made that kind of work easier.
Thanks for bringing that in, because I think that's something that both you and Patrick have alluded to, and it's something that we felt in the inquiry as well, is one, the sense of responsibility, and two, this aspect of trusting the process. For us, we were saying we want, as Debbie said, download that power for communities to have that opportunity to storytell, to view their story, to feel empowered about what has helped and hindered their social action. Mohamed, if you don't mind sharing, there was a really nice reflection that you had about whether to redact names in your story or whether to use pseudonyms. And I was wondering if you could just share that with our audience.
Yeah. For a bit of brief background, so the way that the storytelling worked is that Simon sent over half a page for each family whose story I was adapting into fiction, but obviously anonymized the names, so gave pseudonyms. Part of me, when I started writing the stories, I just had a very keen awareness that these were obviously pseudonyms and not the people's actual names. So I had blacked out the names on the page as I was writing them. So it's just kind of like highlighted in black as if it's been redacted, just to show that, again, a further sense of alienation. It's not just that the reader is not allowed this, but these people kind of like are not allowed under their own names. But then after thinking about it for a while, and after kind of like writing all of the stories, it felt like a bit of a writerly flourish. Somehow it didn't sit well with me. I felt like I was trying to make too pointed of a statement about something that's already present there through the anonymized names. I decided to essentially remove that. It would provide a different sort of barrier with the reader that might not exactly translate the way that I wanted to.
Thanks, Mohamed. That's really interesting. Patrick, I was just wondering, was there any creative decisions that you and Elena had to make when it came to creating the exhibition?
I think a lot of it was just how much of this are we going to do and how much are the kids going to do, because we wanted to be as authentic to the people that use the service as possible. So we had one session where we had our 3 massive canvases. We ended up doing it with a group of like 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds. So we tried our best to make it down to the kids, but we actually got one of the parents to help draw the background, and then we got the kids to colour it in with paint. We got everyone that did their own self-portrait. We had a lot of different mediums on the table, so we'd have crayons, pencils, pens, glitter, all that sort of stuff, so people could really individualise it. And I think that turned out great because they all do look really, really different. There's no 2 that are similar, which I really like because it does show the uniqueness of everybody that's involved in this project.
Thanks, Patrick. Debbie, I was just going to invite you in this moment, having heard the reflections from Mohamed and Patrick, having had conversations with all the co-storytellers at this point. Is there any helps and hinders for storytelling that you would like to bring in that might be different to what we've heard from Patrick and Mohamed?
I mean, I think the issues are brought up, but I think I'll just highlight them. We needed to work relationally with the storytellers, and the storytellers needed to work relationally with the communities. But it was within constrained a period of time of 2 to 3 to 4 months. And that put immense pressure on storytelling, and that time was one of the biggest hinder. And I think that is a hinder in general for social action in general as well, like how time is always limited to do these impactful, more important relational work, which actually is sustainable and it kind of lives on even after it's completed. But I think in terms of the biggest help, I think relational work and the reflective work that we all did together helped in enabling all of us to download that power. And I think that was the beauty of this engagement for me. And some of these relationships, we often say we may not see, how those have connected to each other, but know that they are happening.
So as we're moving to the end of the conversation, I was just wondering whether each of you could give maybe 2 or 3 things that you think our audience, who may be those who are doing social action themselves or those who are funding social action, who want to do storytelling, what would you say are 2-3 things that you would offer as tips or as learnings from this experience?
When it comes to storytelling in particular, I think realizing the boundaries of different types of work that you're doing, it's important to realize that. I think part of me placed a lot of pressure on myself to have the story do everything in terms of informing people, having an emotional impact, making a political statement, and being writerly. That's obviously kind of like a lot to put on any one thing. And I think for me personally, I see storytelling as doing the job of reaching out to a broader range of audiences, sharing a bit of that experience in a way where they can draw out a very different kind of relationship than the one that you can anticipate. So it's important to differentiate between the storytelling work and the activism work the social action might be doing. And just definitely spend time building a relationship and making sure that there is enough trust built there for you to trust your own output, because there will come a point where you just want to delete the whole thing and start from scratch. And I think just don't be afraid to ask for help, especially if you're working within an organization where they are trying to foster that sense of community.
I would say that the biggest thing you need to do is adjust the story to the community. So I think for every story that we've seen in Social Action Scotland, the medium and the way the story has been told is very different depending on the community story you're telling. Like, I think for the Congolese community, sharing their individualized stories of what actually has happened to them in their life is a much more effective method than it would have been for the community I worked with, for example. The central message of our story was better told through more creative and less explicit means. Being able to make that adjustment where you see not just what story are they wanting to tell, but how they're wanting to tell it, I think depends a lot on the community. It's quite a difficult task to be able to pin down what the best way to tell that is, and I don't think every medium works for every community. I think as well, you need to remove yourself a lot from it as a storyteller. And you get your egos in the way and you have this real idea of this amazing thing that you want to do, but it doesn't align with the community's values. That's going to be a point of tension. You need to really be able to go with the flow of the community, take things as they come, and be able to adjust your plans for the people that you're working with. So I think just being very flexible to other people's needs and not let your own ideas of sort of the story you want to tell get in the way of that, and being aware of what the community wants at all stages of the process.
Just reflecting on my own learnings, something I'm really proud of, that I've invested in relationships. That has really been very beneficial for the inquiry, but for the storytelling, for the communities, and it's something which is going to last beyond the inquiry. And that brings in everything else. When you invest in relationships, it brings in kind storytelling, it brings in trust, builds in all the other values that we would like to bring in the prefigurative world. The second thing is very important for me, and it has been important for the inquiry, is to embed reflection in the process of storytelling. And I think that is very important, and we have tried to do it in our own smaller groups, but also invited storytellers to do that, invited the communities to that in some ways or the other, because it helps you to reflect on your own positionality. It helps you reflect on your own privileges, your own helps and hinders, your own struggles, your own vulnerabilities. But more than ever, it helps you also to tell truth to power. Another one would be encouraging creativity and emergence, dare to do things differently, to trust the process.
Thanks, Debbie. Now we're coming to the close of our conversation. Just wanted to offer a checkout. And since we're talking about storytelling and stories, just wondering, what stories are you all dreaming of right now, whether that be in your work or your life or any means?
So I'm currently writing this bit of a love story and love letter to the natural landscapes. Natural spaces in Egypt are very boundaried, and they're very much restricted and put under heavy control by the government and the armed forces. Every desert space is technically army-owned zone, so you can't actually wander out in nature. People find ways of blurring the difference between natural and unnatural, because you still kind of eke out kind of like experiences of what we would call kind of like nature within the cities, and just, blurring the boundaries between built up and natural environments.
To tap onto that sort of idea of nature, I've recently been studying environmental economics and been reading a couple of books that sort of tap into that issue of, well, the environment. Our modern sort of economic system really don't align in values. So to be honest, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently is just how built up the government and economics and politics are against the environment, and how just showing that we don't really have this collective story almost of what we want our future to look like, of how we're going to get there. And I think we're just in this position where the method we've used to run the world for the last few hundred years since the Industrial Revolution, we just don't know how to break out of this hold. And I think we've lost that ability to tap into our communities, our countries, our systems of governance, to realize this is a massive issue we're facing. Nature is dwindling at a scary rate. But on a lighter note, I think by sharing these stories and getting into a collective sort of, this is the only way we're going to be able to tackle issues like this. So right now I'm just thinking, how can we use our own personalities and our own stories to help solve the biggest issues?
I think I completely echo what both of you have said in terms of my dream for a story as well at the moment. It's an ecosystem of communities and kind of breaking down of the existing systems that we all are part of, kind of to build in some networks instead between these communities. And the hope is that these stories that we have all collected and the storytellers' connections and the relationships that we have built are going to be some form of a beginning to some of these connections, that ecosystem, which is going to get wider and which is going to be more interdependent on each other.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm dreaming about, in a way, a personal story of what is next, what is after this point, and trying to have that story be emergent and relational. But there does creep in a bit of the classic, fear and worry about what's going to happen as you're all drawing upon the outer systems as well, and what impacts they're going to have on that dream that I'm having about what comes next. So I'd just like to say thank you all so much for joining us on this episode, and I really hope you've enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you for having us, Amanda.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Mohamed and Patrick.
Woo! Thank you for joining us on this episode about storytelling. If you'd like to explore what we've discussed in this episode further, you can view the full versions of the 17 storytelling pieces on our website socialaction.scot under the Stories tab. You can also view all the links in the show notes of this episode. And just to end, I'd like to offer this question that you can ponder on in your own self-reflective time. And that is, what story do you want to leave for our ancestors? Thank you again for joining us on the Wavicle podcast, and we can't wait for you to join us for the next one.